Thank you, Johnny. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out this afternoon to hear this topic, the tale of two cities, Rome and Jerusalem. And this is a tale of two cities, but in reality it is a story about two different ways of thinking that are presented in the Bible. And one of these ways of thinking is represented by the city of Rome, and the other is represented by Jerusalem. Now, you've probably realised that the title, A Tale of Two Cities, is in fact plagiarised from Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens wrote a book, A Tale of Two Cities, which was about Paris and London in the time of the French Revolution. But perhaps that's appropriate because if you read more deeply into Charles Dickens's book, you realise he too was comparing the two different ways of thinking of the two cities, two different attitudes to life. And so that's really what our lectures, both this week and next week, will be about, the two different ways of thinking from Rome and from Jerusalem. And so today we are going to look at the history of these two different systems, and next week, God willing, we will be looking at the future of these two systems. Now, this is a thematic study, a study about a Bible theme. And what that is when, instead of looking just at one particular chapter or verse and trying to understand that specific chapter or verse, instead we take an idea or a concept that we see in a particular place and we follow that same idea or concept right through the Bible. There are many themes in the Bible, and we find that they can pop up in Genesis, and then they'll pop up again in the prophets, and then they'll come up again in the New Testament, and even right all the way through to the book of Revelation. And that's amazing, isn't it? Because even though these books were written over a course of many hundreds of years by different authors in different countries speaking different languages, these themes still appear right throughout the pages of the Bible. But that can make a thematic study difficult, because to really see the theme and the pattern emerge from the Bible, we have to look at a lot of different passages through the Bible. And so we can't really take the time in a lecture like this to look at each of these chapters in detail. And so perhaps I'd encourage you today to try to get your mind in that space, that we're doing a thematic study. We don't have to necessarily understand every verse in minute detail, but we will try to see the patterns that come out. And hopefully I can highlight them for you. So the first theme I want to look at is the theme of a name. So what is a name? Well, a name is obviously what we call someone. I call Johnny Johnny because Johnny is his name. But the idea of a name actually goes beyond that if you think about it. So let's look at the following examples that we might have in modern life, or perhaps in the relatively recent past. Someone might say, "I arrest you in the name of the king." Hopefully nothing any of us will ever have said to us, but arrest someone in the name of the king, well, the name there stands for the authority of the king. Or you might say of someone that he made a name for himself. Well, the name is, of course, then his reputation. Or perhaps you've heard the term Trumpism, or Marxism, or Calvinism. And these are different ways of thinking associated with Donald Trump, Karl Marx, and John Calvin, respectively. And so their name has sort of come to represent their influence in the world, or their particular way of thinking. Interestingly, when we come to the Bible, we find that the concept of a name in the Bible is quite similar, actually. And so I'm going to put up a couple of definitions on the screen from some Bible study dictionaries that look at the definitions of the word name in the Bible as it is used in the original Hebrew. So the Old Testament Word Study Dictionary says the following: "A name is what specifically identifies a person or anything. To make a name for oneself means to attain a renowned reputation, as when God made Abraham's name great, for example. To become famous is to have one's name spread through the land. To have a good name is to have a good character or a good reputation." Or the Kohlenberger Mounts Dictionary, "A proper designation of a person, place, or thing." So that's the literal, it's what we call something, but then he says by extension it can refer to the renown or fame of something. So a name isn't just what we call something, it refers to its influence, its renown, its reputation. couple of examples. 2 Samuel 8 verse 13. So David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the Valley of Salt. So you can imagine that if you went and had a stunning military victory, that you'd make a bit of a reputation, a bit of a name for yourself, would you not? Or Ecclesiastes 7 verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, or a good reputation is better than precious ointment, speaking about the value of a good reputation. So we see that in the Bible, a name is more than just what we call something or someone. It can represent a person's fame, it represents their influence, it even can stand in for their character. One prevalent theme in the Bible is the idea of the name of Yahweh, the name of God himself. And we read about people praising the name of Yahweh. We read about people alternatively blaspheming the name of Yahweh. If you know the 10 commandments that were given to Israel, the third commandment was that Israel was not to take the name of God in vain. And that's important because we come to understand that the name of God is not just a name. The name of God comes to refer to the character or the moral excellence of God, because that is what God is known for. That is his reputation, if you like, is his character. God is good. God is merciful, gracious, compassionate, and just. The name of Yahweh represents all of those perfect characteristics of God. God is perfectly righteous, and we are desperately wicked. And that is why we seek to praise the name of Yahweh and not our own names. So Genesis chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel. And it's actually quite a short story. It only takes up 9 verses. And perhaps you might read through it and think that it's not particularly significant. But in fact, what we're going to see is that some of the themes in this story start to come out right throughout the Bible. And so what's this story about? Well, this is after Noah's flood, and all these men and women get together and they say, well, if we're not careful, we're going to just be scattered abroad all over the earth. Let's stay together. If we stay together and band together and work together, we're going to be stronger. And so they say, well, let's build this tower, and this tower is going to reach up to heaven. In other words, we're going to be nearly as powerful as God himself because we've built this tower all the way up to heaven. And God saw what they were doing, and obviously God was displeased with that because they were building this tower to try to make themselves as powerful as God. Now, obviously that wasn't going to work, but you see, the motivation that they had for doing this was not good. But it's interesting to read the exact language that the Bible uses. Why were they doing this? Well, it says there in Genesis 11 verse 4, it says, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So you see, why were they doing this? Well, they wanted to make a name for themselves. Well, what was God's response to this? He split them up. They were trying to work together. They were trying to unify themselves, to make themselves strong against God. And so God says, well, I'm not going to allow you to unite in such an ungodly fashion. I'm going to split you apart, split you into all different groups, all different nations, to make sure that you can't do this again. So in verse 7 we read, God says, "Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. So God says, well, I'm going to split you apart. And so their goal was to unify themselves so that they could make a name for themselves. And God says, well, no, I'm not going to allow you to do that. I'm going to split you apart. I'm going to confuse your languages so that you can't band together anymore. Now, just one interesting point to note in verse 2. It says that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. So just another point to note up here. Where were they doing this? This is the land of Shinar. And now, there's absolutely no reason for me to point that out except that it becomes important later on. But for now, let's just remember these 3 points. Why were they doing it? They were doing it to make a name for themselves. How were they doing it? Well, they were doing it by being unified. And obviously God disrupted that unification by disrupting their languages, by splitting them apart into language groups. And where were they doing this? Well, it was the land of Shinar. And so to summarise, this is the way of Babel. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's glorify ourselves. Let's make ourselves important and powerful. So we know what God did in response to that. He split them apart. But God's response actually went further than that. And we can see that if we turn over the page. Well, actually, it's on the same page. We start looking at the very next chapter. It's Genesis chapter 12. And Genesis chapter 12 is where God gives the first promise to Abraham. And he says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram," Genesis 12 verse 1, "The Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So God had split these people apart into all of these different nations, all of these different language groups, to stop them from uniting in an ungodly way. But now God instead is choosing just one nation to work with. And we know, of course, from the rest of the Bible that God now chose Abraham, and he chose Abraham's descendants, the nation of Israel, and God says, "I'm just going to work with this one nation." So this was God's response, if you like, to the Tower of Babel. After the nations had been split up, God chose one nation, the nation of Israel, and decided that he would work with them. So why did God choose this nation? Why did God choose Israel? Well, we're told that later on, much later on in the Bible, in Acts chapter 15. God at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And that's in fact interesting because when we read through what is written about the nation of Israel in the Bible, there is a great emphasis in their worship and in their commandments on glorifying the name of God. So the reason God worked with this nation, Israel, was to bring glory to his name, so that this could be a nation who would bring glory to the name of God. And so there's quite a few examples that we could go through. We find, for example, in Deuteronomy 16, that the law of Israel referred to their capital as the place where Yahweh would place his name. The capital, Jerusalem, would be the place where God would place his name. Deuteronomy 16 verse 2, "Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto Yahweh thy God of the flock and the herd in the place which Yahweh shall choose to place his name there." We see the same idea coming up when David brought the ark up to Jerusalem. It says, "Then say, Save us, O God of our salvation, and gather us and deliver us from the nations, to give thanks to thy holy name and glory in thy praise." This was the reason why God brought Israel out of the nations. This was the reason why God saved them from their enemies. It says in this verse, the reason was so that they could praise his name. Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, in 1 Kings 18 verse 17, it tells us that the purpose of building the temple in Jerusalem was to build a house for the name of Yahweh, God of Israel. And in fact, if you read through 1 Kings 8, which is Solomon's prayer at the dedication of this temple, when the temple was opened for worship, he mentions this idea of the name of God 14 times in just that single chapter. This was a house that was built for the name of Yahweh, God of Israel. And so we find that this was, if you like, the purpose of the nation of Israel. It was a nation that was separated from the world to make a people for God's name. And what does it mean to take a people for God's name? Well, this is a people, a nation who would understand the righteousness of God. They were given God's righteous laws, and so they would understand the righteous character of God, and they would seek to demonstrate that righteousness to the nations around who saw them. So this was a people who would make the God of Israel renowned, would make the God of Israel well known in the earth. They were a people for his name. And the interesting thing is that God promised a response to this. If this nation served God faithfully, if they became a people for his name, then God would respond to that in turn by glorifying that nation. And we see that in Genesis 12 verse 2, the promise to Abraham. He says, I will make of thee a great nation, in verse 2 there, and I will bless thee and make thy name great. And we see the similar promise about the nation of Israel as a whole. In Zephaniah 3, verse 19 to 20, which is speaking about the future of Israel when they return to their God. He says, Behold, at that time I will undo all that afflicts thee, and I will save her that halteth, and gather her that was driven out, and I will get them praise and fame in every land where they have been put to shame. He continues, At that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith Yahweh. So we had the way of Babel, which was let's glorify ourselves. Well, now we find that this is the other way. In contrast to Babel, this is God's way. Serve God and glorify God, and he in time will glorify us. And you could summarise that in the words of James in the New Testament, James 4 verse 10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. So we have here the two ways of thinking. There's the way of Babel, which is glorify ourselves, make ourselves important and powerful. It's human-focused. There's God's way. Serve God and glorify God, and he in time will glorify us. It's God-focused. Now, it's important to understand that these are not just two different ways of thinking, but these are in fact two different plans for how to reunite all the people and all the nations of the world. And we saw that in Genesis 11, didn't we? That was the human way. That was one attempt to unite all of the people of the earth, and God saw the wickedness there, and his response was to split them apart. But we saw God's response further in Genesis chapter 12, where he gave this promise to Abraham. And in fact, if you read in Genesis 12 verse 3, he says to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee, in Abraham, shall all families of the earth be blessed. All the nations of the earth would be blessed in Abraham. It was never just about Israel. It would eventually incorporate all nations. All nations would come to learn of God's way. And so what God is saying is that we will eventually reunite all the nations of the world. All the people of the world will eventually be united, but it has to be done in God's way, not the human way. Now, the story continues, and I'd like you to turn up Daniel chapter 1, if you will. If you know the history of the nation of Israel, they did serve God for a number of years, but gradually they descended into wickedness. And because their wickedness became so great, God brought the nation of Babylon against Israel, and Babylon destroyed their capital, Jerusalem, and took the nation of Israel into captivity. And if you come to Daniel chapter 1, and we're just going to see one verse here, verse 2. It says, And Yahweh gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This is the king of Babylon. Yahweh gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of the king of Babylon with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, only thing you need to see there is that Babylon was in the land of Shinar. And remember, we saw that before, the same place as the Tower of Babel. Now, let's just turn over a couple of chapters more to Daniel chapter 3. And just remember that this is happening in Babylon, in the land of Shinar. Now, in Daniel chapter 3, we find the king Nebuchadnezzar had embarked on a project, a building project. And what he built was this massive image, this massive statue of a man. And this statue was made of gold. And so we see in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 70 cubits, which I think is about 30 metres, something like that. And the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar set up this great image, this great statue, this idol, this golden statue of a man, and he set it up in the plain of Babylon, in the province of Babylon, which, as we saw, is in the land of Shinar. Now, he didn't just set this statue up, but he wanted to inaugurate the worship of this statue. And so it continues in verse 2, Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the councillors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so then it continues in verse 4, Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, you may have heard of this story because this is the beginning of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I just wanted to focus on this first section here because what we find is that, well, the same ideas that were present at the Tower of Babel are coming out again. It's one of these biblical patterns, you see. So, did you notice the language there in verse 4? It says, To you it is commanded, O people, nations and languages. And all of these people, nations and languages were commanded to fall down and worship this image of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had taken Israel captive into Babylon, but it wasn't the only nation. Nebuchadnezzar had conquered quite a few nations and brought them to Babylon. And so perhaps Nebuchadnezzar saw his empire as uniting all of these different peoples into one great Babylonian empire. And he wanted now to unite these peoples into one great worship of this golden image. And so perhaps we can see the same 3 points coming out. How was he doing this? Well, he was doing this by unifying all of these peoples, nations and languages together into the worship of this image. And where was he doing this as well? Well, we saw that in Daniel chapter 1, did we not? It's in Babylon, in the land of Shinar, the same place as the Tower of Babel. And why was he doing this? Who was being glorified by this worship? Well, let's ask the question, whose name was associated with this worship? Let's have a look. Verse 2. This was the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And again in verse 3, the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had stood up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. In verse 5, it's commanded that ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And again in verse 7, all the people, the nations and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. It kind of gets a bit tedious if you read through the chapter. It's Nebuchadnezzar the king, Nebuchadnezzar the king, Nebuchadnezzar the king. So you could just say the golden image, but no, it's the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. It emphasises it over and over again. You see, Nebuchadnezzar intended this image to represent himself, the great Babylonian empire that he had built. And in commanding all of these people and nations and languages to fall down and worship the image, he was commanding them to fall down and worship Nebuchadnezzar the king. Look how great I am. I've made this image. So why was this worship being done? Well, it was to make a name for Nebuchadnezzar the king. And in summary, Nebuchadnezzar's religion was intended to unite all people, nations, and languages, not to glorify God, but to glorify and empower himself. So we see there that the themes that started with the Tower of Babel pop up again in Daniel chapter 3, in the worship that Nebuchadnezzar inaugurated in Babylon, in the land of Shinar, the same place. Same ideas behind this worship. It's the uniting of people, uniting of nations, but it's done for the wrong reason. It's done to glorify man and not to glorify God. Well, the story continues, and this time we're looking at the other way, God's way. And to see how that continues, turn over to Acts chapter 2. Because in Acts chapter 2, the same ideas come up again, but this time we get an insight instead on God's plan. You see, we saw from the promises to Abraham, God chose the nation of Israel, but God's plan was never to just make it about the nation of Israel. God's plan was always that this would include all of the nations of the world eventually. And that became clear in the work of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was born as a Jew. His ministry, he preached almost exclusively to Jews. And yet, you may know the very famous quotation, John 3 verse 16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And you notice it doesn't just say whichever Jews believe. No, it says whosoever. Not just Jews. Anyone who believes in Christ can have eternal life. And so, although Christ preached mainly to Jews in his ministry, after he ascended into heaven, the time had come to spread this hope of salvation that started with the Jews. The time had come to spread that beyond Israel to all the other nations of the world. And we see that happening. We see the start of that process in the book of Acts. And the kickoff for that process is really in Acts chapter 2. And this is the story of the day of Pentecost. So in Acts chapter 2 it starts, when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. So all of the disciples of Christ were all together in this one room. And it says, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. So the Holy Spirit came on the disciples, and the disciples were now given this power, this miraculous power to speak in other languages. And why were they given this power? Well, we see that as the chapter continues. It says, there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. Now this was the feast of Pentecost, and all of these Jews from all of these different nations had come together to Jerusalem for the feast. And when they heard that the disciples were speaking with all these different languages, they were amazed, and they all came together. It says in verse 7, they were all amazed and marvelled, saying one to another, behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia and in Judea and Cappadocia, in Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, in Egypt and in the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians, we do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. So there were all of these different nations and languages present, and God gave this miraculous power so that all of these different nations and languages could hear the message of the gospel. They were all came together so that Peter, through the rest of this chapter, could speak to them about the hope of salvation in Jesus Christ. So we see this pattern of this idea of languages and different nations is coming out again. And whereas for the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages and God dispersed the nations, now God does the exact opposite. God provides miraculous powers so that the disciples can break down these barriers of language and race. And so we can follow our same three ideas through again. There was the unification of diverse nations and languages. And why was this being done? What were they using these miraculous language powers for? Well, look at verse 11. We do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. And Peter would go on to give a speech to all of these different nations and languages. And he says there in verse 21, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So why were they given this power to speak in all of these languages? Well, it was ultimately for the praise and glorification of God. And where did this happen? Well, it happened at Jerusalem, did it not? And we can read further on in Peter's speech, and Peter later in his speech would speak about the hope of salvation in Jesus Christ, and he would speak about Jesus Christ ruling on the throne of David, and of course the throne of David was from Jerusalem. The place associated with this movement is Jerusalem. And of course that is referring to the hope of the Old Testament, the hope that was started in the Old Testament, the hope of the future kingdom of God, which is to be over the whole earth and to be ruled from Jerusalem. We're not going to go into that in detail now. We'll look at that more in our next study. But you see there we have the same 3 points, but this time it's God's way. And so for the Tower of Babel, God deliberately confused the languages, where in Acts chapter 2, he provides miraculous powers to break down the barriers of language and race. And so here we have our 2 ways. We've got the way of Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to unite all of the nations for his own glory. It's a human-focused way of uniting. We have the way of Jerusalem, which is God's plan to be glorified by all nations in the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And similarly, this is a plan for uniting nations, but it's God-focused, not human-focused. So the question is, how does the way of Babylon become the way of Rome? Because you remember our title, it's the Tale of Two Cities. It's the tale of Rome and the tale of Jerusalem. But up here we've got the way of Babylon and the way of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem matches, but how do we get to Rome? Well, let's look at that now, shall we? In Daniel chapter 2, which we're not going to look at in detail today, but in Daniel chapter 2, there was a prophecy given by Daniel to King Nebuchadnezzar. And this prophecy was a prophecy of a succession of world empires that would come after Babylon. And the prophecy looked a little bit like this. It was a statue, an image of a man. And it was made of all of these different materials, different metals. And what we understand is that this prophecy was speaking about a succession of empires that would come after Babylon. And I'm just going to go through this briefly. We'll look at this in more detail next week, God willing. But what we see is that the Babylonian Empire was succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire, which is what was prophesied in Daniel chapter 2. And similarly, following the prophecy, the Medo-Persian Empire was eventually succeeded by the Greek Empire. And again, as predicted in Daniel chapter 2, the Greek Empire was eventually succeeded by the Roman Empire. And so there was this succession of empires, from the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians to the Greeks to the Romans. And so, according to the vision of Daniel chapter 2, the Roman Empire was the successor to Babylon. The Roman Empire was the heir to the way of Babylon, if you like. And it's not just Daniel chapter 2 that contains this idea. It comes up elsewhere in the Bible as well, that Rome is the heir to the way of Babylon. Rome is the spiritual successor, the spiritual heir to the Babylonian way of doing things. And one chapter that brings that out very strongly is Revelation chapter 17. And if you'll turn up Revelation chapter 17, we'll have a look at how this idea comes out. Now, I should say that Revelation is a highly symbolic book, and it can be very complicated to interpret. But on the other hand, there are some parts of Revelation which are quite straightforward. There are parts of Revelation that are quite straightforward, and the reason they're straightforward is because the book of Revelation itself gives us the interpretation for certain parts of the vision. Certain parts of the prophecy are actually interpreted within the book itself. And so, while some parts of Revelation are quite difficult to understand, some parts are actually relatively straightforward. And thankfully, Revelation 17 is on the more straightforward side of things. And so, Revelation chapter 17, and starting in verse 3, we read, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So John, who was given the revelation, he sees this vision of a woman sitting on a beast. So it's a vision, a dream almost, of this woman sitting on a beast. And of course this woman is symbolic. But later on, the chapter will tell us what this woman represents. But if we continue in verse 4, it says, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." Now, we'll see there, it's pretty obvious what sort of woman this is. She's, firstly, very rich, and secondly, she's very wicked. She's a woman of intense wickedness. She's got a golden cup, and the golden cup is full of abominations. It's full of fornications. This is a woman of intense wickedness. We continue in verse 5, "And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." So this is the name of this woman. The name of this woman is Babylon the Great. This woman is called Babylon the Great. Further down in verse 6, "And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration." And so there's further proof of the wickedness of this woman. She's drunken with the blood of the saints, with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. She's been drinking their blood so much she's become intoxicated. Of course, it's symbolic, but it's a very graphic symbol, isn't it? It's a very, very wicked woman. And later on in the chapter, we get some clues that help us to understand exactly who this woman is. And there's 2 clues that are given to us. In verse 18, it says, "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth." So it tells us straight out that this woman sitting on a beast, this woman is a symbol for a city. And perhaps we could have already deduced that, because if her name is Babylon the Great, then it certainly sounds like she's a city, doesn't it? And we see it's a city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So in other words, it's a city which had authority over a great number of different nations. It's a city which is ruling over this empire, which is uniting a number of different nations. Which is interesting again, because that's our theme that we saw popping up again, the unification of a number of different nations. So that's one of the clues this chapter gives us, but the biggest clue, in fact, is in verse 9. It says, "Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." So this woman is sitting on 7 mountains, but this woman is a city. So which city was built on 7 hills? And which city had authority over a great number of nations in the time of the New Testament? Well, there's only one good answer to that question, and that is, it's the city of Rome. The city of Rome is quite famously built on 7 hills. You can look up online, there are maps which will show you the city of Rome with the 7 hills labelled on those maps. Interestingly, there was a coin that was issued in the 1st century, a Roman coin. And it's a little bit hard to see there, but on the right-hand side there, Rome is depicted as this woman sitting on 7 hills. And I've actually numbered them there for you, so it's a little bit hard to see, but you can actually make out all 7 hills that this woman is sitting on. So the city of Rome, according to Revelation 17, is Babylon the Great. So, how do we get there? How did Rome become Babylon the Great? Well, Revelation is the last book of the Bible, and Revelation was written about 60 years after the ascension of Jesus Christ into heaven. So at this point, the trail that we've been following through the Bible peters out, and instead we have to follow the clues that the Bible has given us into the pages of history. In the book of Acts, we see the story of the New Testament. The gospel of Jesus Christ was spread around the Roman Empire, and the book of Acts ends with the Apostle Paul in prison in Rome. And to that point, the Apostle Paul had successfully spread the gospel throughout a large part of the world as it was then known. But at that point, Christianity, the worship of God and his son Jesus Christ, that was still very much a niche religion. It was only a very small number of believers, relatively speaking. But over the next few centuries, it increased in popularity. And by the time we get to 300 AD, 300 years after Christ, despite numerous rounds of persecution by the Roman government and the authorities of the empire, it's estimated that Christianity had grown to as much as 10% of the Roman Empire, or around 5 to 6 million people. And at this point, in the early 300s AD, something happened that changed the course of history. You see, up to this point, Christianity was a minority religion. Paganism was the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and anyone who forsook paganism to become a Christian was risking persecution, torture, and death. But that all changed in 312 AD, when Constantine the Great became the Roman Empire. Constantine wasn't a Christian, but he was a Christian sympathiser. His mother was a Christian. Some of his closest advisors were Christian bishops. In 312 AD, Constantine was at war with his chief rival Maxentius, and their two armies came face to face outside of Rome, outside of the city itself. Maxentius was inside Rome. Constantine had come from outside. And Constantine had his army, but they were heavily outnumbered. The night before the battle, Constantine claimed that he looked up into the sky and he saw a vision of a cross in the sky. And that night, he had a dream. And in that dream, he claimed, Jesus Christ appearing to him. And Constantine claimed that in this vision, he was told to write the first two letters of the name of Christ. In Greek, it was the letter chi and the letter rho. He was told to write these two letters on the shields of his soldiers, and he was told that in this sign you will conquer your enemies. So Constantine woke up from this dream and he did this. He wrote this symbol on the shields of his soldiers, and the following day the two armies clashed together, and Constantine won a decisive victory over Maxentius. It's called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And following that battle, Constantine became emperor of part of the Roman Empire, and he issued the Edict of Milan, which proclaimed religious toleration. So Christians were no longer persecuted. This edict declared that any confiscated property should be returned to the Christians. And eventually Constantine became emperor over the whole Roman Empire. And then he deliberately started going out of his way to favour the Christians as much as possible. And there's a list we could go through of all that Constantine did to favour the Christians. He made the Christian clergy exempt from taxation. He gave them the right to use the postal system and the horse system that were normally reserved for government officials. He closed the law courts on Sundays because that was the Christian day of worship. He donated large amounts of money to churches. He funded the construction of new churches from the imperial treasury. Whereas the previous emperors had decreed that the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, the Bible should be burnt, Constantine commissioned scribes to make new copies of the Bible. And these copies were done on a high quality type of parchment. They were done on animal skins and encrusted with jewels. And Constantine sought out Christians to visit him at the imperial court, and he appointed Christians to higher level positions in the government. And I thought I'd quote from one student of church history, and he makes this comment on the effect of Constantine's policy changes. And this is in fact from a podcast. Well, it's a history lecture that was presented in a podcast. And so that's why the language is a little bit more informal, because this was a spoken source. And he says, "We had mass conversions after this. People start joining Christianity in droves. Before this, to be a Christian, you were taking a risk. You could get executed for becoming a Christian. You could lose family members that would no longer talk to you. You would suffer to become a Christian. Not always, but the risk is always there. After this, to be a Christian is to have the emperor's favour and to be one of the cool kids, if I can put it like that." So this was the effect of Constantine's changes. Christianity rapidly gained popularity. You might think, isn't that a good thing? Isn't it good if the Christianity becomes popular? Well, the problem is that Christianity itself was fundamentally altered in the process. There was a fundamental change in the attitudes and beliefs of Christians at large following the ascension of Constantine. And that is known as the Constantinian shift. I'm going to look at another quote from another author, which gives some insight into why Constantine was doing this. And it helps us to understand why Christianity was changed so much by Constantine's policy. So this is from a book called When Jesus Became God, and the author writes as follows: "In a little more than 1 decade, Christianity had been transformed from a persecuted sect into the religion of the imperial family. Constantine was far too canny to attempt to outlaw his religious opponents, who still constituted a majority of Roman citizens. But there was nothing to prevent him from favouring the church, as his predecessor had favoured the old religion. Among his first acts were decrees aimed at compensating Christians for the sufferings and depredations of prior years, and granting Christian clergymen the special privileges formerly accorded only to pagan priests. His true goal, beyond favouring his co-religionists, was to unite the empire's diverse, quarrelling peoples into one huge spiritual fellowship." So you see, this was Constantine's motivation for doing this. Constantine saw Christianity as a way of uniting all of the diverse people, nations, and languages of his empire. It was a way of consolidating his own power. And there's a problem with that, because if Constantine is going to use Christianity to unite the empire in this way, then Constantine had to do something about the disagreements and the factions and the different doctrinal positions within Christianity itself. You see, there were many different factions and doctrinal positions within Christianity. But now there's a new way of deciding on all of these different issues. Instead of appealing to what the Bible says and trying to get to the truth of the matter through the Bible, instead you just need to get the emperor on your side. And from this time we start to see Constantine actively interfering in the affairs of the church. And perhaps the most famous instance of that is the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. There was a division regarding the nature of Jesus Christ and his relationship to the Father. One side of this issue believed that Jesus Christ was subordinate to his Father, that was the Arians. The other side believed that Jesus Christ and the Father were essentially the same essence. They were called the Athanasians. Now, I don't want to go into that controversy in this lecture. I don't believe either side had the truth. But the important point is that it was Constantine who instigated the council to discuss these things. Constantine paid for the bishops to attend this council. He paid for their travel, he paid for their food, and he participated in this council himself, even though he wasn't even a Christian. And so you won't be surprised to hear that the council decided in favour of Athanasius, which just happened to be the side that Constantine's advisors supported. So Constantine himself is now interfering in Christianity to make things come out the way he wants them to. And not only that, but following the decision of this council, those who believed the other position, Arius and his supporters, they were excommunicated and they were sent into exile by the emperor. And so the point here is that Christianity was no longer about what is the true worship of the true God. Christianity was increasingly becoming about what would promote the power and the influence of a few people, a few powerful men at the top of the hierarchy. And now that's not to say that Christianity didn't have issues, didn't have doctrinal errors before Constantine, but Constantine was an inflection point. And from the time of Constantine, Christianity increasingly turned away from the Bible and turned away from the authority of God's word towards human authority. A quote from another author who writes the following about this time. It seems extraordinary that today that a Roman emperor should devote so much of his time and energy to fine points of religious doctrine. But Constantine's interest wasn't driven by theology so much as it was by a need to find a political solution to a problem he'd inherited from Diocletian. The cult of the god emperor was finished. Not even Diocletian could be bothered keeping up the pretense that he was the incarnation of Jupiter. It invited ridicule when emperors retired to grow cabbages. If Christianity was to form a new moral basis for the Roman Empire, then Constantine would need to find a formula that would make his religion work as a governing ideology, a set of values and ideas that could persuasively explain why he, Constantine, deserved to rule, that would give his empire energy, cohesiveness, and direction. A Christian ruler couldn't be a god, but he could present himself as a ruler chosen by God, as Christ's regent on earth, the favourite of heaven. So, whereas the teaching of Jesus Christ that he taught his disciples that the world would hate them for following him. Instead of that, from the time of Constantine, the church and the state, the church and the world became increasingly intertwined, because Constantine needed the church, and the leaders of the church increasingly needed Constantine. They used the power of Constantine and the Roman government and the Roman army to persecute anyone who disagreed with them, and that was how they maintained their power. So there's an interesting shift that happens, and one example of that shift is in the attitude of Christians towards the military. Whereas before Constantine, Christians refused to participate in the military. Now Constantine had Christian bishops travel with his armies to bless their battles. There's one quote from an ancient author, Hippolytus, he wrote around 215 AD, so around 100 years before Constantine, and this gives an idea of the attitude of Christians towards the military before Constantine came along. He writes the following: "A soldier of the civil authority must be taught not to kill men, and to refuse to do so if he is commanded, and to refuse to take an oath. If he is unwilling to comply, he must be rejected for baptism. A military commander or civic magistrate who wears the purple must resign or be rejected. If an applicant or a believer seeks to become a soldier, he must be rejected, for he has despised God." So that was what Christians believed before Constantine. They absolutely would not have anything to do with the military. And of course, we know that that was what Christ commanded, was it not? He told his disciples to resist not evil. He told them to turn the other cheek. He told them to love their enemies and bless those that hate them. There was not a single Christian theologian before Constantine who endorsed the use of violence, even against the enemies of the Christians. But now, there were Christian bishops who went with Constantine to bless his armies, to bless his soldiers. They were not only participating and endorsing the military, but they were even using the military against fellow believers, against fellow Christians. Another quote, again from when Jesus became God. Constantine had appeared at the council in the role of a peacemaker. His decision to enforce what he took to be a theological consensus by exiling Arius, however, meant that the victors in religious disputes might now use the power of the Roman state against their enemies. This was a lesson that all parties to the conflict were quick to learn. And again, another quote, only a few decades previously it had been a crime to be a Christian. Now it was a crime to be a heretic. The church silently accepted this development without protest. How much easier it was to use the authority of the state to silence heretics instead of arguing with them. But soon, large elements of the church were labelling each other as heretics and using the sword against each other. eventually far more Christians were slaughtered by the sword of the church than had ever been slain by the Romans. That's interesting, is it not? Because what did we read in Revelation 17 verse 6 about Babylon the Great? I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And included in these persecutions were anyone who still believed the true doctrines of Christianity. They were persecuted and killed by the state-endorsed Church of Constantine and those who succeeded him. One final quote. The central nature of this change, which Constantine himself did not invent nor force upon the church, is not a matter of doctrine or polity. It is the identification of church and world, and the mutual approval and support exchanged by Constantine and the bishops. The church is no longer the obedient, suffering line of the true prophets. She has a vested interest in the present order of things, and uses the cultic or the religious means at her disposal to legitimate that order. The church was using religion as a way to endorse the government, the state of Constantine. The favouring of Christianity by Constantine caused some fundamental changes in Christianity itself. It was no longer anything about glorifying the name of God. Instead, it had become a religion that was used as a weapon to unite the Roman Empire, to unite the diverse peoples of the Roman Empire around a common set of beliefs in order to protect and promote the power of a few people at the top of the hierarchy. And there's no doubt about who this religion was supposed to glorify. Constantine himself built a new capital and named it after himself, called Constantinople. He built a magnificent church in the city, which was called the Church of the Holy Apostles. And inside that church, he built 13 tombs. Now, the first 12 of those tombs were for the 12 apostles. The 13th one was for Constantine himself. He promoted himself as being equal to the apostles of Jesus Christ. And so, in conclusion, these were our two ways. The way of Babylon became the way of Rome. We can see how the city of Rome started to morph into becoming Babylon the Great. Rome inherited the way of Babylon. Rome inherited the attitude of the Tower of Babel. The tale of two cities becomes the tale of Jerusalem and Rome. But that's only the beginning of the story, because the religion that Constantine helped to create morphed over time to become the Roman Catholic Church. And that way of thinking is still very much alive today. And to see how that happened, and to see what the Bible prophesies about the way of Rome and the way of Jerusalem, we need to wait for next week's lecture, when we will see how the story will end.